Every single discipline that has ever existed has that one central concept upon which basically all things hinge, but is so needlessly overcomplicated and mystified, even by experts and pros, that a lot of people just give up trying to understand it. In Smash, this is definitely neutral. There's a glut of guides on neutral, and one definitely can't say they're wanting for raw resources on the topic, but for some reason, neutral still remains the single biggest enigma for a lot of people. Many say that neutral is hard to teach, and to some degree that's true, but it's only true for the same reason it's harder to feed a man than it is to teach him to fish. Neutral is very nuanced and can become very deep very quickly, but just like a tree can grow into a million distinct branches and be impossible to describe branch by branch, all those branches, no matter how differently they bend and wind, and every tree for that matter, can be described by a much simpler root. Neutral is often explained in terms of its branches rather than its root, or more concretely, it's described from halfway up the tree with particular instances of neutral, like sword character neutrals or projectile character neutrals, rather than from a set of rules that explain neutral at its foundation regardless of what form it takes. Neutral is simply the art of hitting an opponent that doesn't want to get hit, or as you may have heard it described, the state when neither player has an immediately actionable advantage over the other. While these are certainly true, they only beg another question. How exactly does one gain an advantage if the opponent doesn't make obvious errors? And though neutral can be won because the other person is making obvious errors, we can't rely exclusively on the other person's errors to succeed. Rather, we need to find some way of making our own openings, which is the heart of neutral, making openings. And 3 facts make openings inevitable and unavoidable. First is that much of what we do is anticipatory. This means that we are rarely reacting in direct response to what our opponent does, but rather are acting largely in anticipation. This means we can both deceive and be deceived. Second, neutral is a zero-sum game. What that means is that every single thing that you do is to some degree a commitment that hedges your resources from one place to another. Imagine if someone is trying to punch you in the face. You block with your hands, but by moving your hands in front of your face, you've exposed everything else. The same principle applies to neutral in that everything you do has an inherent flaw, even if very small, precisely because by the first point, if we anticipate incorrectly, we leave some kind of opening since no one option covers all possibilities. Third and last, unless your opponent is playing purely by their sense of smell, everything we do influences our opponent and establishes some kind of expectation, assuming they don't want to get hit. That your opponent must act in response to what you do doesn't give you direct control of them, but it gives you indirect control. Now, let's look at an example so we can put these 3 facts to paint and see them come together in action. As Ganon, if I throw out a neutral air, by point number 3, generally speaking, my opponent must do one of 3 things to not get hit. 1. Shield. 2. Stay out of range. Or 3. Challenge me. If any of these are done successfully, I've not directly accomplished anything. What I have done, however, is influenced my opponent by establishing an expectation, thus indirectly controlling them. By point number 2, if my opponent either shielded, stayed out of range, or challenged me, they would have lost to something that beats shield, like Ganon's side B, lost to my whiz kick, or lost to an attack from a vulnerable angle. By point number 1, my opponent didn't react to my neutral air, but anticipated it, which means they're open to being deceived and either choked, whiz-kicked, or forward-aired. With these 3 points in mind, it seems like I have the beginnings of an opening. I may have not directly accomplished anything yet, but I've established an expectation, in this case neutral air, and now have an opportunity to exploit the inherent flaw in the option they might now use out of expectation, and win neutral as a result. Thus, we can say that neutral is simply a constant cycle of 2 distinct phases. First, the expectation phase, where we influence our opponent to behave in certain ways based on what they must do to not get hit or what they must do to hit us. And second, the exploitation phase, where we attack the inherent flaw in their response to what they anticipate. This is neutral in a nutshell. Establish expectations, make people behave in certain ways even if those behaviors aren't directly punishable, and use those expectations and behaviors to create openings. With all this being said, this ability to create openings depends largely on 2 player attributes. 1. Understanding what people must do if they don't want to get hit, or what they must do if they want to hit you, like in the Ganon neutral air example. 2. Understanding the tools your character has that can act upon or subvert the expectations you've just established. Now, 2 considerations that can guide your neutral are the following. 1. What kinds of behavior does action X get? And this action can be anything, even just something like Sonic's fast and scary movement. The trick here is deciding if the thing in question is useful, and some things will be more or less useful against certain characters and players than others. And second, what can I do to exploit that behavior? These questions can be structured, and this knowledge can be put into action through what I call complementary sequences. Complementary sequences are sequences of moves such that one move exploits the flaw in the option that the previous action forced or strongly suggested, but can't itself do anything about. To use the earlier example, if I neutral air, this may force a shield, but neutral air doesn't really get me very far against shields. But now that I've established the expectation for nair, and my opponent is preemptively shielding, I can choke them. This neutral air to choke pair thus forms a complementary set. And here's a concrete example of that in action. Now, here's a slightly more advanced example. Neutral is, at its foundation, exploiting your opponent's expectations or obligations to behave in ways that you've either knowingly or unknowingly established, but this doesn't always play out in ways as obvious as 2-move sequences, like the neutral air to choke sequence. In the last clip, each time Isabelle shot her slingshot, the inherent flaw was giving up space. It's not a large flaw, but it's still a flaw. On my end, the inherent flaw in my option to advance was being open to being grabbed. In terms of complementary sequences, these exchanges might look something like this. The takeaway here is that the basic structure and rules of neutral are always the same, even if somewhat drawn out. Expectations are knowingly or unknowingly established, and inherent flaws in the option based on that expectation are exploited, even if it takes a while to actually hit the opponent and thus win neutral. Neutral is simply establish and exploit. This being said, neutral does go both ways, and as such, a critical aspect of it is awareness of your own openings and how you might be manipulated, like in the Isabelle example. Naturally, this suggests that some infinitely deep Yomi is possible and implies some ancillary skills. But my goal with this video has neither been to make masters of neutral overnight, nor to exhaustively list the infinitely many chains of potential neutral exchanges, but to describe the building blocks and elements to understand the foundational structure of neutral, and as such be able to independently develop your own neutral game from the ground up. Once you understand the structure of neutral, everything else is mostly just a matter of the fun part we all really want to get to, which is creativity. Now, to what I'm sure is almost everyone's delight, I think that will about do it for this video. Neutral is a complicated topic, but with, I argue, very simple rules, and I hope I did a passable job of conveying what I think those rules are without frustrating yet another wave of students of neutral. As always, thanks to everybody who stuck with me to the end of this video. I've made a habit in the past of promising a particular topic, but I failed to deliver that particular video in a timely manner 80% of the time. So for now, I'll just say I hope you all look forward to the next SmashConceptions.